Hello, how are you doing? I hope you're having a good weekend and reading good things over it. There another best books of the year list came out this time in The Guardian, and I know it seems like I go through a lot of these, but I just really enjoy looking through a whole variety of best books of the year lists and find it really valuable to see where there's crossover between the lists. Sometimes there'll be a new book that I've never heard of before, and sometimes a book will be repeatedly mentioned. Like the book Cast by Isabel Wilkerson in the last two videos I made about best books of the year of 2020 lists. That book was cited on both of those lists. And I just read that, finished reading that this weekend. It was so good, such an interesting insight into racism in American history and gave me a really new perspective on it, how, the continuation of it is, a product of the caste system. I found that so fascinating, and so I find it really valuable at this time of year to catch up on some of the best books of the years, and these lists help me find that. So this is the first UK list that I'm looking at, published in The Guardian, and it's more a sort of general overview of sort of fiction of the year. I mean, there's different sections of different kinds of books, and I'm only looking at the fiction section here because, that's sort of my passion, and so I thought I'd go through it fairly quickly. I've got a lot of the books stacked up here to talk about, and I have a better hit rate on this list than the other lists that I've been looking at. So Justine Jordan, one of the editors and journalists for The Guardian, came up with this list, and she cites 39 books of fiction that have been published over the past year, and I have read 20 of them. Well, 20 and bits of two of the other books, and I'll mention why that is when I'm going through them. Because it's kind of more of an overview of some of the best books of the year, I think she picks a lot more prize winners and things like that. So ones that I've sort of naturally been reading, since I read a lot of books for book prizes and stuff. And because it's a UK list, it's just more fiction that's been published here that I'm more familiar with than some books get published in the States and don't get here for quite a while, or if at all. So I'm going to go through the list, starting with Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell, which of course won the Women's Prize for Fiction this year, and which I really enjoyed the experience of reading about this period in the 1600s when a plague was in London and had beset the family of Agnes and her husband Shakespeare, and the death of their son due to that plague. And she mentions Justine Jordan mentions in the beginning of this article how it's almost eerie how there are several books that were published this year that happen to do with plagues and widespread illnesses, and and this is one of them. And it's so incredible that there's a section in this where she charts how a plague traveling across the globe and the different people that it's sort of who contract it as it's makes its way to this family. And even though I didn't enjoy this as much as some other people did, people who really, really loved it, I found such more appreciation for it when I was talking about it with Anna James when we were discussing the Women's Prize list, and she made such interesting insights into it that I hadn't really thought of before, and that gave me a different point of view on it, and which is why I love following books prizes so much, because it gives us a chance to have these more in-depth discussions about books which we may not think about quite as complexly if we're just sort of reading them on our own, and so to get other people's perspective and all of that good stuff. Then there is The Pull of the Stars by Emma Donoghue, another book which sort of deals with plague-like conditions, this time in the early 1900s in Dublin in the maternity ward of a hospital. And I've not read this yet, but I'm really looking forward to it. I hope to read it before the end of the year because it's had so much praise, and I think it's appeared in some other book prize lists as well. And I've read books by her before, and I really love her writing. The Silence by Don DeLillo. I did read this novel. It's quite a short novel, and Don DeLillo is a writer that I really enjoyed early on, like in my sort of college years. I read a lot of his work and really enjoyed it, but just haven't read much of his fiction lately. And this didn't inspire me to read too much more. It's sort of about apocalyptic type conditions when an airplane crashes and people are sort of stuck inside and they don't have communication with the outside world, and the media seems to be shutting down. And it's told in this sort of strange style, and I sort of enjoyed it and appreciated it, and I read the entire thing aloud to my partner, which made it a sort of fun experience in itself. While actually we were driving across Europe this past summer, sort of amidst a plague, so it made for very atmospheric reading. But yeah, it hasn't really stuck with me, and is more sort of like an interesting thought experiment rather than a sort of work of fiction that I could lose myself in the characters and the story. Weather by Jenny Offill, another book that was listed for the Women's Prize for Fiction, was my personal favorite to win the prize. And yeah, just the way this sort of looks at climate change and a lot of our modern preoccupations, but in this very funny and engaging way, a sort of like biting humor. It's not really situational humor, but just more sort of her wry observations and this impressionistic look you get at this librarian's life. Summerwater by Sarah Moss, another novel I've been really meaning to get to. It's not all that long either. I don't know why I haven't read it yet, but I almost wonder if we're like past the season of reading it, since I think it takes place during the summer of a camping trip, a sort of rainy camping trip in Scotland of a group of people that are drawn together, and that but I know like it shouldn't matter what season you're reading a book in, but yeah, I almost feel like it's past that. But what a beautiful cover, isn't it? The Sunken Land Begins to Rise Again by M. John Harrison. I've not read this novel, which is about a sort of post-industrial England and two lost souls that are wandering through it. Sounds very eerie and intriguing. Then there is The Sublime Summer by Ali Smith, a novel I loved so much. Obviously, it's the completion of her quartet of novels, and I do think you have to have read the other novels to really appreciate this, since so many of the characters come back in this, although obviously you can read it on its own. It has a lot of commentary about Brexit, and it was still being written this year, so it's about the pandemic as well as a lot of other issues and the refugee crisis, but also a lot of reflections on art and nature, written in such a beautifully engaging way that's also very humorous and so insightful and wonderful, and but also really fascinating looking at characters who aren't necessarily sympathetic. Some of them they're quite like hard-edged, so I think she does such a great job at showing a diversity and spectrum of types of people. Another conclusion to a massive writing project, The Mirror and the Light by Hilary Mantel, which I just devoured the entire trilogy this year, and was such a wonderful and absorbing experience. I mean, so much has been said about this, the great conclusion to her Thomas Cromwell trilogy, that I don't feel like there's really much to add, except that it's, if you want a book and a series to get lost in, that takes a bit of effort as well. It's not easy to get into these books. I don't think, they are challenging, but so rewarding. This Mournable Body by Tsitsi Dangarembga, another conclusion to a trilogy, this time one that was much longer in the making. And I read this a couple of years ago. I just didn't really get along with it. But I was sort of glad it was listed for the Booker Prize this year, because there's been so much more discussion about it, much more than I think when it was published. And it has made me think more complexly about the story. I mean, it hasn't convinced me to want to go back and reread it, but I would like to go back and reread the first book, Nervous Conditions, because I did love that novel. The Shadowkin by Maaza Mengiste, another Booker Prize shortlisted novel. Like I said, she talks about a lot of prize listed books in this, and a lot has been said already about this novel, about Mussolini's invasion in Ethiopia, and I did take me a while to get into it, but does have a lot of fascinating characters and moving scenes. So it's another book that I think is well worth the effort. Jack by Marilynne Robinson, another conclusion to a quartet of books. And I don't know, I'm really torn about whether I want to just jump in and read this or go back and read the first three books. I have read two of the books in the series before, and I know people have said like I don't need to go back and reread them to read Jack and appreciate it, but I've still not read Home, and I feel like I should read that maybe before reading this. And I just have such high expectations for this, and I'm quite sure I'm gonna love it. So I almost just want to have the whole experience of reading all four books at once. But I don't know, maybe that would feel like too much of it. You know, I did get sort of wary of Hilary Mantel because there was just so much of it. I mean, it's over 2,000 pages, that whole trilogy. So, and I know this isn't quite as long, but I don't know, this is me doing a lot of hand wringing, which is probably unnecessary, but it's the silly things that, you know, us readers can get all in a tangle about. The Vanishing Half by Brit Bennett, a novel that's been much praised and has sold so well, and lots of people have been loving this story about twin sisters who are light-skinned African-American women that go on to lead very different lives, where one chooses to pass as white and the other one returns to her black community and lives there with her daughter, and who are really fascinating daughter. And yeah, there's so much to say about this novel. It's so artfully written and brings up many interesting issues. Utopia Avenue by David Mitchell, about a band in the 60s and following their different lives and the formation of this band and how it breaks apart. And I enjoyed this, and thought it was, you know, it has lots of interesting things in it, but I didn't love it as much I was hoping it would. I definitely didn't think it was sort of worth all of the, you know, the giant amount of page numbers that it took to get through it. But, you know, it's an enjoyable experience, and if you're really into music from that period, you'll probably really appreciate this novel. Mr. Wilder and Me by Jonathan Coe, a novel I've been really curious to read. I've liked reading Jonathan Coe's writing in the past, and this is all about the director Billy Wilder, and I think that's such a fascinating subject matter, and so I am really keen to read this. Rodham by Curtis Sittenfeld, and I got this on audiobook, this sort of alternate history of Hillary Rodham Clinton's life, and imagines her life if she hadn't married Bill Clinton. And I started listening to it, but I felt like I don't know enough about Hillary's life to know where she's diverging, you know, from what actually happened in her past. So I feel like I almost need to read a biography of the actual Hillary Clinton first before reading this, you know, fictionalized account of her life. If you've read this, I'd love to know your thoughts about it, of whether that's necessary or not. Inside Story by Martin Amis, described as an autofiction, a fictional account that uses a lot of his own biography, and I'm just not interested in this. I don't enjoy Martin Amis's writing. I don't enjoy listening to interviews with him because it just riles me up, because he's so like stuck in his ways and old-fashioned and disses contemporary literature in this really snobbish way. And so yeah, I'm not interested in this. Mayflies by Andrew O'Hagan, a novel about young Scots in the 80s and following their different lives and experiences. I've not really heard much about this, but I would be really curious to read it. I think I've read one other book by him in the past, and but he's never been a writer that I feel like, oh, I must read his next book. Such a Fun Age by Kylie Reid. This is such a pleasurable and fascinating read that deals, you know, with a lot of contemporary subjects and looks at white allyship in this really compelling way. And I just enjoyed this novel so much. It does have a sort of plot twist, which I think is a bit implausible, that sort of relies on coincidence too much. But yeah, such a good book. Exciting Times by Nisha Dolan, one of the most hyped debut novels of this year, and a novel I enjoyed reading so much. It's such a fascinating look at the life of a young Irish woman living in Hong Kong, and gets involved in this complicated complicated romantic triangle with a man and a woman. And something I really appreciated about it was the way it looks at our lives are mediated through online relationships, and it's very funny how she looks at the way those relationships develop and the sort of self-consciousness around how we relate to other people online. That's a really great aspect of it, as well as many other great aspects of it. There's so much in it about language, and yeah, it's very funny read. Shuggie by Douglas Stewart, the much loved and popular winner of the Booker Prize this year, although still slightly contentious. Not everyone is happy that it won the Booker Prize this year. I was personally very happy that it won, since I loved the story so much. And yeah, and you know, there have been some criticisms made about it, that it doesn't do anything too inventive with its structure, and that its story isn't all that inventive. But I disagree. I think that the vehicle that he chose, you know, the way he structured the novel to tell this story about a young boy and his mother growing up in Scotland in the 80s, and the mother's struggle with alcoholism, the structure he chose for that was entirely suited for the story and what he wanted to say in the story, I think. And also there's a criticism made that it's now such a popular novel that the judges just sort of went with the popular choice. But I don't really agree, because when this was longlisted for the Booker Prize, I don't think a huge amount of people were reading it. I mean, it was published earlier this year in America, and I don't think it made too big a splash at the time. And you know, when it first came out here, I think in August, not too many people were talking about it, but then because it was on the Booker Prize, people started discussing it more and reading it more. And so, you know, I think it is an example of how the prizes really helped the popularity and public appreciation of this novel. And yeah, of course, not everybody loves it, but you know, that's what makes reading interesting, that we can have these discussions about books. The Young Team by Graham Armstrong, a novel about a young teenage English Gain, and it's meant to be a sort of updated version of Trainspotting for a new generation, or that's sort of how it's described in shorthand. I've not heard that much about this novel, but I'd be curious to read it. Rainbow Milk by Paul Mendez. I loved reading this debut novel so much, which is a coming-of-age tale about a young man who is thrown out of his Jehovah's Witness family in the north of England and moves to London to try to make a life for himself here, and he becomes a male prostitute, and how he's sort of grappling with his sexual and racial identity, but does so in such a moving way. It's such a striking character like none I've read before, and I just appreciated this novel so much. Burnt Sugar by Avni Doshi, another Booker Prize shortlisted novel, and one of the most tense mother-daughter relationships you'll ever read, about a daughter who's caring for her mother, that is sort of might be suffering from early dementia, and how it's difficult to care for her mother when her mother didn't care for her so much when she was growing up, or didn't, you know, nurture her in the way that she should have been, and how there is such a bitterness between them, and how that plays out is so done in such a fascinating way. You know, it's the novel I was hoping would win the Booker Prize, though I'm not mad at all that Shuggie Bain won, since I also loved that novel so much. But yeah, I hope people continue to read and discuss this novel as well, and I can't wait to read more by Avni Doshi, since this is her debut novel. Real Life by Brandon Taylor, another book on the Booker Prize shortlist that I started reading and just gave up on because I just wasn't enjoying it. I was finding it a real slog and really depressing to read. And you know, it's not that I don't appreciate depressing reads, because a lot of the fiction I do read is quite depressing, but just the way it approached the characters and its subject matter just really didn't chime with me. The Liar's Dictionary by Ellie Williams, a sort of dual narrative about two quite solitary, introverted individuals at opposite ends of a century who work at a publisher's that publishes a dictionary, and how they're researchers in it, and it follows their different experiences. And this is such a funny and I don't like to use the word quirky, but it is quite like a quirky story. Her perspective, the way this author sort of looks at the world and organizes it and thinks about it in terms of language is so unique and fascinating that I found it really engaging and wonderful to read. The Line Life of Adults by Elena Ferrante, about a teenage girl in Naples who's struggling to connect with her parents and her coming of age story. And I've not read any Ferrante before, but I know I need to make that change. In 2021, I definitely need to read Elena Ferrante. Hurricane Season by Fernanda Melchor, a novel about a witch in a small village and about misogyny and murder. And it's such a thrilling, like fast-paced, really high-octane story that I just was completely gripped by, and I loved this novel. I was hoping it would win the Booker International Prize this year, but sadly not. The Discomfort of Evening by Marieke Lucas Regnevald, the actual winner of this year's Booker International Prize, and a novel that I didn't enjoy so much. It's another novel that I found such a slog to read and really depressing and really off-putting in some ways. It does give a fascinating perspective about a girl on a Dutch farm who's grieving from the loss of her brother, and her entire family is grieving from his loss, and is about the process of that. And it is interesting, but wasn't for me. Till by Daniel Kelman, about a folkloric jester during the 30 Years' War in Europe, and the way this looks at history and really fascinating characters from history, I found so engaging and enjoyable, and I really want to read more of Daniel Kelman's fiction. Little Eyes by Samantha Schweblin, a novel about these cute small gadgets which infiltrate people's homes, or people welcome them into their homes, and that are installed with a camera that someone across the world is viewing them from. And so it is a sort of interesting look at voyeurism, but I didn't enjoy this novel as much as I was hoping I would. I do really enjoy Samantha Schweblin's approach to looking at the world, and the way she writes fiction I think is really interesting, but this novel didn't completely hit home with me. When We Cease to Understand the World by Benjamin Labatut, about exceptional minds in the 20th century and looking at the dark heart of maths and sciences. I've not really heard of this book before, but it sounds really fascinating. The Dominant Animal by Catherine Scanlon, a debut collection of short stories, which I've been meaning to get to. I've heard really great things about this, so I'm glad this list is prompting me to go back and read this. It's quite a short collection, so I don't think it'll take me too long to get through. Modern Times by Kathy Sweeney. This is the second book, in addition to Real Life, that I've read a bit of, and this is a collection of short stories, but I didn't stop reading it because I wasn't enjoying it. I just sort of got distracted and haven't gone back to it. I've read about half of the short stories, which are, so this is by an Irish writer, and they're sort of kind of fairy tale-ish, but very adult type fairy tales, as you can probably tell by the suggestive cover. But I really enjoyed them. They're very funny and give a sort of different insight. Reality and Other Stories by John Lanchester. I've been wanting to read this, though I haven't read anything by John Lanchester before, but it's meant to be a collection of ghost stories, but is also about technology, and I am very intrigued by it. The Voice in My Ear by Francis Leviston. This is a novel that's sort of halfway between a collection of short stories and a novel. It's about 10 different characters who are all named Claire, but who have different lives from each other, and that sounds really intriguing. Good Citizens Need Not Fear by Maria Reva. This is another book that I've not really heard of before, but is sort of interconnected short stories about a crumbling apartment block in post-Soviet Ukraine. The Bass Rock by Evie Wyld, a novel which is about 3 different women in different periods of time, all in the same location, and the way it looks at these different women's lives is so fascinating and compelling, and I love Evie Wyld's writing. And finally, Pir Nasi by Susanna Clark, a novel that's appeared on some other Best Books of the Year list, and one I've been wanting to get to so much. It's this another novel that's kind of like a treat novel that I'm saving up to read over the month of December. I'm definitely hope to read it before the end of the year. And I've heard such great things about this, about a man who lives in a large house that's full of strange objects, and how there's a sinister story behind this setup that he may or may not want to admit exists. So those are all of the books, quite a few I just raced through, but I'd be really interested to know how many of these you've read, which if you'd really highly recommend any of the ones that I personally haven't read, or if you want to have discussions about any of the ones that I have read. I'd love to discuss them in more depth, because we don't have to just do it in a prize context, we can just do it anyway. But I'll put a link below to the full article if you want to read more of Justine Jordan's thoughts about these books as well, or if there are any other best books of the year lists that you've come across and have really enjoyed and want to put that link in the comments below, that would be great as well, because I just can't get enough of these lists. So thank you for watching, happy reading, I'll speak to you again soon. Bye.